The Ironclad was not a happy ship. It was the fist of Captain Draegan, Iron Hand, the Pirate King of the Northern Passage, and it was as unforgiving as its master. Draegan ruled through two principles: absolute efficiency and brutal, unwavering discipline. His crew was a collection of the hardest men from the world's dirtiest ports, men who respected only strength and feared only him. On this ship, weakness was a disease, and compassion was a symptom that was quickly and violently purged. And on this ship, there was no one weaker than the boy. He was known only as Kale, the mute cabin boy, a slip of a child, no more than 10 summers old, with wide, haunted eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow of the sea. He had appeared on the ship a year ago, brought aboard by the captain himself, and left to fend for himself among the wolves. His silence made him a target. The crew, bored and cruel, saw him as a plaything, a convenient outlet for their casual brutality. They would trip him as he carried buckets of water, steal the meager rations from his plate, and mock his inability to cry out. To them, he was an orphan, a stray, a ghost who did not matter. Only in one place on the ship did the boy find sanctuary. The galley. Elara, the ship's cook, was a woman who had learned to survive by being useful and invisible. She was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency in her domain of heat and steam, her presence so constant and unassuming that the crew barely registered her as a person. But she saw the boy. She saw the bruises hidden under his collar, the hunger in his eyes, the profound, soul-crushing loneliness that clung to him like the sea mist. And so she committed her own quiet rebellion. She would accidentally drop a warm biscuit near him. She would leave an extra bowl of stew unattended where she knew he would find it, when he would seek refuge in the heat of her galley, pretending to be scrubbing pots. She would speak to him softly, telling him stories of the land, of green fields and quiet forests, painting pictures with words for a boy who had none of his own. He would just listen, his large, sad eyes fixed on her, a silent, grateful shadow. Theirs was a secret friendship, a tiny island of warmth in a vast, cold sea of cruelty. What Elara didn't know was that their secret was not a secret at all. From the raised quarterdeck, or through a hidden peephole in his grand cabin, Captain Draegan watched. He saw every shove, every stolen piece of bread, every whispered taunt directed at his son. And he saw every act of kindness from the cook. Draegan was a man living in his own private hell. Kalen was his only son, the last piece of his beloved wife, who had been killed in a rival attack years ago. The boy had witnessed a murder, and the horror had stolen his voice. Draegan, paranoid and consumed by grief, believed the only way to protect his son was to hide him in plain sight, to forge him in the same fires that had forged him, to make him so tough that no one would ever see him as a target. He was testing his son, but he was also testing his crew, looking for any sign of humanity, any flicker of decency. For a year he had found none, until Elara. She was a variable he had not anticipated, a woman who, for no reason other than the goodness of her own heart, risked the ire of the crew to show compassion to the weakest among them. He watched her, intrigued, his hardened heart stirred by a feeling he had long since buried. Was she a fool, or was she the strongest person on his entire ship? The final test came on a gray, wind-whipped afternoon. Silas, the ship's first mate, was a man who mirrored the captain's discipline, but none of his hidden depth. He was a bully who mistook cruelty for strength. He had been looking for an excuse to make an example of the useless, mute boy for weeks. A coil of rope, left unsecured, had rolled across the deck during a change in the wind. It was not Kalen's fault, but he was the closest. It was enough. "You worthless whelp!" Silas roared, grabbing Kalen by the scruff of his thin shirt. "An unsecured line can kill a man. It is time you learn the price of laziness." He uncoiled a short, thick rope from his belt. "Truss him up," he ordered the nearby sailors. 10 lashes. To teach him a lesson in discipline. The crew gathered, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and casual indifference. This was shipboard entertainment. Kalen's eyes were wide with pure animal terror. He didn't make a sound, but his small body trembled uncontrollably. Elara, drawn from the galley by the commotion, saw the scene unfold. She saw the fear in Kalen's eyes. She saw the cruel smile on Silas's face. And something inside her, the quiet, invisible cook who had survived by never making waves, finally snapped. She pushed her way through the wall of rough sailors. "Stop," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the sudden silence. Silas turned, an incredulous sneer on his face. "What did you say, cook?" "He's just a boy," Elara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved until she was standing directly between Silas and Kaelin, a small, unassuming woman against a mountain of muscle and cruelty. "He made a mistake. The punishment is too harsh." "The punishment is what I say it is," Silas snarled, his patience gone. "Now get out of the way, before you taste the rope yourself." "No," Elara said, her voice shaking but her resolve like iron. She looked at the terrified boy behind her, and then back at the cruel first mate. She took a deep breath. "If a debt must be paid for the rope, let it be paid. But you will not lay a hand on him." She turned her back to Silas, shielding the boy completely. "I will take the lashes in his place." A collective gasp went through the crew. Such a thing was unheard of. It was madness. It was suicide. Silas stood there, stunned into silence, the rope held uselessly in his hand. The entire ship, for one long, silent moment, held its breath, and from the quarterdeck above, Captain Draegan, who had seen and heard everything, finally, slowly, began to descend. The game was over. The descent of Captain Draegan from the quarterdeck was a spectacle of dread. He did not rush. Each heavy footfall of his iron-heeled boots on the wooden steps was a drumbeat, counting down the seconds to a terrible judgment. The rough, jeering crowd of pirates parted for him like the sea before a storm, their faces, moments before filled with cruel amusement, now pale masks of terror. They avoided his eyes, staring at the deck, at the rigging, anywhere but the cold, silent fury of their king. Draegan stopped a few feet from the tableau at the center of the deck. His gaze was unreadable, a calm sea before a hurricane. He looked at Silas, the first mate, who stood frozen, the rope still clutched in his hand, his face a mixture of arrogant defiance and dawning fear. He looked at the trembling form of his son, Kaelin, half hidden behind Elara, and then his eyes settled on her. Elara stood with her back to him, her small frame a defiant wall protecting the boy. She was trembling, but she did not turn, did not flinch. She was a lone sparrow shielding her nest from a hawk, an act of such impossible, suicidal courage that it defied all logic in this world of predators. "First mate." Draegan's voice was deceptively calm, a low rumble that cut through the silence. "Report. What is the meaning of this circus?" Silas, emboldened by the captain's quiet tone, saw a chance to reassert his authority. "The boy was derelict in his duties, Captain," he said, puffing out his chest. "An unsecured line. I was administering standard discipline." The cook interfered. "She interfered," Draegan repeated, the words flat, holding no judgment. He walked slowly around the group until he stood before Elara, his shadow falling over her. She finally turned her head to look up at him, her eyes wide, but her jaw set with stubborn resolve. "And what was your proposed solution, cook?" he asked, his gaze intense, analytical. He was not looking at her as a man looks at a woman or a captain at a servant. He was looking at her like a strategist studying a new, unexpected piece on the chessboard. "He is just a boy," Elara said, her voice shaking but firm. "The mistake was small. The punishment was cruel. If a price had to be paid, I would pay it." Draegan held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The entire crew waited for the explosion. They waited for him to back his first mate, to order the cook flogged for her insolence, to restore the brutal order they all understood. "I see," Draegan said at last. He then turned his gaze back to Silas. "You are correct about one thing, first mate. Discipline is the bedrock of this ship." His voice dropped, losing its calm and gaining a sharp, lethal edge. "But you have forgotten the most important rule of discipline. It flows from the top. I am the captain. I am the law. I am the one who tempers justice with judgment. And you," he took a step toward Silas, who involuntarily flinched, "are merely a tool of my will, a tool that has overstepped its function." He gestured to the coil of rope in Silas's hand. "You are so eager to teach a lesson with this rope. Let me teach you one. To threaten a child for a minor offense is not strength. It is weakness. To be challenged by an unarmed cook and to be stopped by her words reveals that your authority is a hollow shell. The public humiliation was a blow more stunning than any physical strike. Silas's face turned a mottled red. But the cook's offer is a fair one, Draegan continued, his voice ringing across the silent deck. A debt must be paid. Drop the rope. Confused, Silas let the rope fall to the deck. Now, pick it up, Draegan commanded, and present it, not to the boy and not to the cook. Present it to me. A wave of shock and disbelief rolled through the crew. What was he doing? Trembling with a mixture of rage and fear, Silas picked up the rope and held it out. Draegan took it. He did not look at it. His eyes were locked on Silas. For undermining the chain of command, for your display of weakness, and for disrupting the order of my ship for your own petty ego, 10 lashes. He turned to the boatswain, a giant of man who oversaw punishments. Administer the discipline. Now. The crew was stunned into absolute silence. The captain was going to have his own first mate flogged. It was unthinkable. It was a complete upending of the ship's hierarchy. Silas paled, a look of pure, terrified disbelief on his face. As for you, Draegan said, turning his back on the unfolding punishment and facing Elara. She still stood protectively in front of Kaelin. You have also disrupted the order of my ship. Elara braced herself. Her turn had come. You have shown a courage that shames every man on this deck, he stated, his voice loud enough for all to hear. But you are a cook. Your place is in the galley. Your actions, however noble, were an act of insubordination. He paused. Such a quality cannot be left unchecked, nor can it be wasted scrubbing pots. He looked her up and down, his gaze piercing. From this moment on, you are no longer just the ship's cook. You are appointed as the ship's quartermaster of provisions. All rations, all supplies, including the rum, will be under your authority. You will answer to no one but me. It was a move of pure Machiavellian genius. With one sentence, he had simultaneously punished and promoted her. He had elevated her to a position of immense power, placing the crew's most desired commodity, their food and drink, under her control. He had made her untouchable, tying her directly to his own authority. But it also dragged her from her safe, invisible world and placed a massive target on her back. The crew would now have to come to her, to the woman who had shamed their first mate, for their daily bread. You will report to my cabin, he continued, his voice dropping so only she could hear. Every morning, with the boy, you will bring him, and you will give me an account of the ship's supplies and his well-being. Is that understood? Elara could only nod, her mind reeling. She had stepped in front of a whip to save a boy, and in doing so, she had been bound by an invisible chain to the most dangerous man she had ever met. He dismissed the crew with a sharp gesture. He knelt down so he was eye level with his son. He placed a large, heavy hand on Kaelin's shoulder. He said nothing, but his eyes for a fraction of a second were filled with a father's fierce, aching pride. Then the mask of the Iron King slammed back into place. He stood, gave Elara one last unreadable look, and turned, walking back toward his cabin without a backward glance, the sounds of Silas's punishment beginning behind him. Elara stood alone in the center of the deck, the small, warm hand of the boy she had saved now clutching hers. She had won. She had saved him. But as she looked at the great, dark door to the captain's cabin, she felt a profound sense of dread. She had not escaped the storm. She had just walked into its very eye. The Ironclad had a new queen, though she wore an apron instead of a crown. Elara's sudden, shocking promotion sent a current of resentment and confusion through the ship. She was now the keeper of the keys, the guardian of the ship's lifeblood. Men who had once sneered at her now approached her with a grudging, fearful respect, requesting their daily rations of rum and hardtack. She dispensed them with a quiet, firm fairness that gave them no grounds for complaint, but her new authority felt like an ill-fitting coat, heavy and conspicuous. Her safe, invisible world was gone forever. The true crucible of her new life, however, was a daily report. Every morning, as the sun climbed over the horizon, she would lead Kaelin, the silent boy, to the great, dark door of the captain's cabin. The first time she knocked, her hand trembled, But the voice that answered, a low, calm enter, held no menace. The cabin was a world away from the grit and grime of the ship. It was a cavern of dark wood, worn leather, and the smell of old books and the sea. It was a lair of a predator, but a thinking one. Maps of unknown coastlines covered a massive table. Celestial charts were pinned to the walls, and shelves were crammed with books on history, naval strategy, and philosophy. And at the center of it all sat Captain Draegan. He was not the terrifying king of the quarterdeck. Here, he was a different man. Quieter, more observant. The first few meetings were a tense, formal affair. She would stand before his desk, with Kaelin standing silently beside her, and give a precise, factual report of the ship's provisions. Draegan would listen without interruption, his eyes missing nothing. His questions were sharp, intelligent, and always related to the logistics of the ship. But his true focus was always the boy. His gaze would linger on Kaelin, a silent, weighty assessment. "Is he eating well, quartermaster?" he would ask, his voice flat. "Yes, captain," Elara would reply. "Has he had any trouble from the crew?" "No, captain." It was a strange, stilted ritual, a conversation between two adults that was entirely about the child who stood between them, a silent, haunted ghost. Elara began to realize that this daily report was not about the ship's supplies. It was an excuse for this powerful, emotionally distant man to see his son, to gauge his well-being through the eyes of the one person on the ship who showed him any kindness. As the days turned into weeks, the formality of their meetings began to fray at the edges. Draegan would ask her about her own life before the Ironclad, about the island she came from. She, in turn, grew bold enough to ask him about the books on his shelves, about the strange artifacts he had collected. They discovered a shared, unexpected love for history. Their conversations, always with the silent, watchful presence of Kaelin, began to stretch longer. They were no longer just a captain and his quartermaster. They were two intelligent, lonely people, finding a strange intellectual companionship in the most unlikely of places. The true breakthrough came from a boy. One morning, while Elara was discussing a damaged crate of flour with the captain, Kaelin, who had been quietly looking at a detailed drawing of a seabird in one of Draegan's books, tugged on her sleeve. He pointed to the bird, then looked at her, his eyes wide with a silent question. "It's an albatross," Elara said softly, kneeling down to his level. "They say they carry the souls of sailors lost at sea. They can fly for years without ever touching land." Kaelin looked from the book to his father, who was watching the scene with an unreadable expression. And then the boy did something that made the world stop. He opened his mouth, and a small, raspy, almost inaudible sound came out. It was not a word, but it was a sound of intent, a sound of a voice struggling to be reborn. He pointed at the bird again, and then at his father. Draegan's face, usually a mass of iron control, crumbled. He looked as if he had been struck by lightning. A raw, powerful emotion, a mix of shock, hope, and a grief so profound it was breathtaking, washed over him. He stood abruptly, turning his back to them, and stared out the stern window, his shoulders tense. Elara knew, in that moment, that she had crossed a threshold. She had stumbled upon the great, secret wound at the heart of this powerful man. "Captain," she asked softly. He did not turn. "Leave us," he said, his voice a raw, choked whisper. She took Kaelin's hand and led him out of the cabin, her own heart aching with a confusion of pity and fear. Later that day, he summoned her back. Alone, Kaelin was not there. The cabin was dark, the curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. Draegan sat not at his desk, but in a worn leather chair, a half-empty bottle of rum on the table beside him. "You have a right to know," he began, his voice low and rough, "the truth of the boy." And then the story came pouring out. Not the story of a king, but of a husband and a father. He spoke of his wife, a fiery, beautiful woman who was his equal in every way. He spoke of their son, Kaelin, a bright, happy boy who was the center of their world. And he spoke of the attack. A rival pirate, a man he had once called a friend, had betrayed him, leading an ambush on his ship while it was docked. Draegan had fought like a demon, but his wife had been killed in the crossfire. And Kaelin, just a small boy, had seen it all. He had seen his mother die, and he had not spoken a single word since. "The world is a cruel place for the son of a pirate king," Draegan said, his voice heavy with a guilt she could now understand. "My enemies would use him as a pawn to get to me. I thought that he was just another anonymous boy. If he learned to be tough, to survive among the wolves, he would be safe. I thought my coldness was a shield for him." He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was that of a man confessing his greatest failure. "But your kindness, it has done more to heal him in a few weeks than my harshness has in a year. I was trying to forge him into iron, and you reminded me that he is still just a boy." The secret was out. The silent, haunted boy was a hidden prince of this iron kingdom, and she, the cook, was the only other person in the world who now knew. It was a burden and an honor. Understanding the depths of a person's pain is a first step toward true connection, a theme explored in all the greatest love stories ever told. It's in these moments of shared vulnerability that characters forge the bonds that we, as an audience, find so compelling and unforgettable. And if you're as fascinated by these intricate relationships as we are, and want to see how this newfound trust between Elara and Draegan develops, you might want to subscribe to the channel, ensuring you're with us for every step of this emotional journey. Elara now held the king's greatest secret, and in doing so, she held a piece of his heart, whether either of them was ready to admit it or not. The king's confession changed the air between them. The last walls of formality and rank crumbled, leaving a raw, unguarded space. Elara was no longer just a quartermaster, and he was no longer just a captain. They were two co-conspirators, two guardians united by the shared, secret purpose of protecting and healing Kaelin. Their daily meetings transformed from formal reports into quiet councils of three. Elara would describe the boy's small progresses, a flicker of a smile, a new drawing he had made. Draegan, in turn, began to share stories of his wife, of the woman Kaelin had lost, painting a picture for Elara of the family that had once been. In Kaelin, the change was most profound. Now that his two worlds, the quiet, gentle world of the galley and the remote, powerful world of his father, had merged, the terror in his eyes began to recede. He started spending more time in the captain's cabin, not as a silent observer, but as a participant. He would sit at the great map table, and with a piece of charcoal, he would begin to communicate, drawing pictures, asking questions, his silent world slowly beginning to open up. Draegan, watching this, felt a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, and his gratitude toward Elara grew into a deep, powerful reverence. But on a ship as small and insular as the Ironclad, no secret is truly safe, and no shift in power goes unnoticed. Silas, the first mate, had not forgotten his humiliation. Stripped of his authority and shamed before the crew, a bitter, resentful poison had taken root in his heart. He watched the new dynamic with a cold, calculating eye. He saw the closed-door meetings. He saw the captain's softening demeanor. He saw the new, quiet confidence of the boy he had tried to break. And at the center of it all, he saw the cook. He did not believe the captain's cover story for his actions that day. There was something more to it, something personal. He began to watch Kaelin, not as a target for bullying, but as a clue. He noticed the boy's uncanny resemblance to the captain, a resemblance hidden by his small frame and sullen demeanor, but visible in the line of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze. And a dark, ambitious thought began to form in Silas's mind. He started to build his own kingdom of whispers in the dark, fetid corners of the ship. He sought out the men who were most resentful of Elara's new power, the men whose rum rations she had cut for drunkenness, the men who felt the captain's new, softer approach was a sign of weakness. "Have you looked at the boy?" he would murmur to a disgruntled sailor over a game of dice. "Look closely. Who does he remind you of?" "The captain is not the man he once was," he would say to another. "This woman, she has a strange hold over him, and the boy is at the center of it. A king with a secret is a king with a weakness." Silas was not a fool. He knew he could not challenge Draegan directly. Iron Hand's legend was too strong, his grip on the loyal majority of the crew too absolute. But a legend can be chipped away. A grip can be loosened. He needed a crisis. He needed to prove that the captain's softness, his obsession with the boy and the cook, was a danger to them all. The opportunity arose during a tense passage through a string of islands controlled by a rival warlord, Draegan, with Elara and Kaelin now as his constant shadows on the quarterdeck, was negotiating a treaty, a move of diplomacy that the old Draegan would have scorned in favor of brute force. Silas saw his chance. Under the cover of a moonless night, he and a handful of his conspirators sabotaged a key piece of the ship's rigging, the main topgallant brace, a line crucial for controlling the highest sail and for making quick, sharp turns. It was a subtle act of treachery, a fraying of the rope that would look like natural wear and tear, but that would fail catastrophically under pressure. His plan was simple. When the captain next gave an order for a hard tack in a tight spot, the rigging would fail. The ship would be momentarily crippled. It would be a small disaster, but enough to sow doubt, to make the crew question Draegan's command, to prove that his focus was no longer on the ship. But Silas had made a critical miscalculation. He did not know that Kaelin, the silent boy, had spent his entire life on this ship. He knew its sounds, its rhythms, its every groan and sigh better than anyone. As he was walking the deck with Elara, he heard it, a faint, unnatural creak from the rigging high above, a sound that was out of place. He stopped, his head tilted, his eyes scanning the complex web of ropes. He tugged on Elara's sleeve, pointing upward, a look of urgent concern on his face. "What is it, Kaelin?" Elara asked, following his gaze. She couldn't see anything wrong. He tugged again, more insistently, and began to make a frantic, tearing motion with his hands, his eyes wide with alarm. He was trying to warn her. The boy, who had no voice to shout a warning, had seen the betrayal that no one else had. The stage was set for a disaster, but the silent prince, the boy they all thought was weak, was the only one who knew the storm was about to break. Elara trusted the boy's instincts. Kaelin's fear was a language she had learned to read perfectly, and what she saw in his eyes now was not the familiar terror of a bully, but a deep, intelligent alarm. He was not afraid for himself. He was afraid for the ship. "Show me," she said, her voice low and calm. He led her to the base of the main mast, pointing insistently upwards into the dark web of rigging, again making the fraying, snapping motion with his hands. Elara knew she could not go to Draegan with something so vague. He was in the middle of a tense parley with the rival warlord's envoy, a meeting that would determine the safety of their passage. An interruption without proof would be a grave offense. And going to Silas, the first mate, was out of the question. He was the source of the crew's cruelty, a man she would never trust. She made a choice, a dangerous, decisive choice. "Stay here," she told Kaelin, then turned to the grizzled, one-eyed sailor who stood guard at the foot of the mast. "I need to inspect the lines in the main top," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her quartermaster rank. "The boy thinks he heard a fray." The sailor grunted, skeptical but unwilling to defy a direct order from the woman the captain now favored. Climbing the rigging of a pirate ship was a treacherous task for a seasoned sailor. For Elara, it was a terrifying ascent into a world of swaying ropes and howling wind. But the thought of Kaelin's warning, of a potential danger to the ship, to their home, pushed her onward. Clinging to the ratlins, her knuckles white, she climbed. High above the deck, where the wind whipped with a fierce intensity, she found it, just as Kaelin had sensed. The main topgallant brace, a rope as thick as her arm, was not just frayed. It had been deliberately cut, sawed through most of the way, the wound disguised with tar and dirt. It was sabotage, a death trap waiting to be sprung. As she stared at the severed line, a cold dread washing over her, she heard a voice from below. It was Silas. He was standing at the base of the mast, looking up at her, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He had seen her climb. He knew that she knew. "It seems the cook has become a sailor," he called out, his voice laced with mock amusement. "Be careful up there, quartermaster. It's a long way down." It was a threat, clear and cold. Before she could react, he turned and bellowed an order to the helmsman, a man loyal to him. "Hard to port. A squall is coming. Brace the yards." It was a lie. The sky was clear. But it was a command that would put immediate, catastrophic strain on the very line she had just discovered. It was a death sentence, delivered in the guise of seamanship order. Everything happened at once. The ship began to turn sharply. The sabotage brace, unable to take the sudden, immense pressure, snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The massive topgallant yard, a wooden beam the size of a tree, was ripped free from its rigging. It swung down in a terrifying, deadly arc, a pendulum of death, right where Elara was clinging to the mast. She screamed, but below her, another figure was moving. Kalen, who had been watching in horror, had seen the look on Silas's face. He knew what was about to happen. He didn't hesitate. He ran, not away from the danger, but towards it. He launched himself at the heavy coils of the main sheet rope that lay on the deck, and with a strength no one thought he possessed, he heaved. The swinging yard arm, pulled by the shifting weight of the sail, was just about to smash into Elara. But Kalen's desperate pull on the opposing line was just enough. It didn't stop the yard, but altered its trajectory by a few crucial feet. Instead of crushing Elara, the massive beam slammed into the mast just below her, the impact sending a violent shudder through the entire ship and throwing her from her hold. She fell, but the altered swing of the yard had created a cascade of chaos. Other lines snapped, and a tangle of rigging and canvas fell with her. She landed not on the hard deck, but in the thick, heavy folds of the sail, a fall that bruised her, knocked the wind out of her, but miraculously saved her life. The entire ship was in chaos. Men were shouting, trying to control the rogue sail. In the midst of it all, Draegan burst from his cabin, his face a mask of thunder. His meeting had been interrupted by the sound of the brace snapping. He took in the scene in an instant. The broken yard, the tangled rigging, and Silas, standing with a look of feigned shock that didn't quite hide the triumphant glint in his eyes. And then he saw her, Elara, lying tangled in the sail, unmoving. And he saw his son, Kalen, scrambling toward her, his face a mask of pure, silent terror. In that moment, the Pirate King, the strategist, the cold, calculating ruler, vanished, and only the father remained. He let out a roar, a sound of such primal, protective fury that it seemed to shake the very air. He was not looking at the damage to his ship. He was not looking at the enemy envoy who was now staring in shock from the quarterdeck. He was looking at Silas, and his eyes promised a reckoning that would be swift, absolute, and drenched in blood. The trap, meant for the queen, had just sprung on the king's heart. The roar that tore from Draegan's throat was not the command of captain. It was the sound of father witnessing his world on the verge of shattering. For a year he had played a long, agonizing game, hiding his heart, suppressing his instincts, all in the name of protecting his son. In one terrible instant, that game was over. He moved with a speed that defied his size, a blur of motion that seemed to teleport him from the quarterdeck to the center of the chaos. He didn't go to the broken mast. He didn't go to Silas. He went to them. He fell to his knees beside the tangle of fallen sail, his hands searching frantically. Elara! She stirred, a low moan escaping her lips, her eyes fluttering open. She was bruised, battered, but alive. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the loyal members of the crew, but Draegan barely registered it. His attention was on Kalen, who was now clinging to Elara, his small body trembling, his silent tears soaking the front of her torn dress. The boy was looking not at Elara, but at him, his father, his eyes wide with a terror that was not for himself, but for her. And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Draegan. He looked from his son's desperate face, to Elara's pained one, to the snapped rigging above. He saw Silas, try to melt back into the crowd, his face now a mask of pure reptilian fear. And the king of the Northern Passage, a man known for his cold, calculated strategies, finally, completely lost control. "You," he snarled, his voice a low, guttural sound of pure, condensed rage. He rose to his feet, a predator who had just seen his den and his cub, attacked. He turned and faced Silas. He didn't draw a sword. He didn't need to. The sheer force of his presence, of his absolute murderous intent, was a weapon in itself. "Captain, it was an accident," Silas stammered, taking a step back. "The brace was old. It—" "Liar," Draegan hissed, and the word cut through the air like a whip. He took a step forward. "I saw you. I saw the order." He took another step, his voice dropping to a terrifying conversational tone. "You thought to remove a piece from my board. You thought the cook was a distraction. You thought to sow chaos, to show the crew that I was weak. He was now standing directly in front of Silas, towering over him. The crew, pirates and envoy alike, watched in horrified silence. "You are right about one thing, Silas," Draegan whispered, his voice dripping with venom that would make a serpent proud. "I have a weakness, a secret I have guarded with my life." He reached out, not to strike Silas, but and pointed a single, trembling finger at the small boy who was still clinging to Elara. "That boy," he roared, his voice now a thunderclap that rolled across the entire ship, "is not an orphan. He is not a stray. He is Kalen, son of Draegan and Annalise, the heir to my ship, my name, and my entire kingdom. He is my son." The secret, held for so long, was out, exploding onto the deck with the force of a cannonball. A wave of stunned, absolute shock rippled through the crew. The mute cabin boy, the target of their taunts, the weakest among them, was their prince. Draegan turned back to Silas, and the last vestiges of the calculating king were gone, replaced by the pure, unfiltered fury of a father. "You did not just endanger a member of my crew. You did not just sabotage my ship. You raised a hand against my blood. My son." He finally drew his cutlass, the hiss of steel sliding from its scabbard the only sound. And for that there is no mercy. The reckoning was swift and brutal. Draegan did not play with him. He was the executioner, and he lived up to his name. The fight was over in 3 moves, ending with Silas on his knees, disarmed and defeated. But as Draegan raised the sword for final blow, a small hand tugged on his coat. He looked down. Kalen was standing there, his face streaked with tears, shaking his head frantically. He looked from his father's face to Silas, and then to Elara, who was now sitting up, watching with pained, pleading eyes. The boy, who had been the victim of so much cruelty, was now pleading for the life of his tormentor. It was an act of such profound, unexpected grace that it stopped the Pirate King in his tracks. Draegan looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw not the silent, broken child he had tried to hide, but a boy with a heart as strong and compassionate as his mother's. He looked at Elara, the woman whose own compassion had shown his son the way, and he realized the terrible flaw in his plan. He had tried to protect his son by surrounding him with monsters, hoping to forge him into iron, but he had been wrong. The greatest protection was not a shield of fear and hardness. It was a bulwark of love and loyalty. His plan to keep his son safe had failed. It was Elara's kindness that had truly saved him. He lowered his sword. He looked at Silas, his eyes cold, but the murderous rage gone. "You are not worth the steel," he said, his voice flat. He turned to his loyal men. "Put him in chains. He will be left on the first deserted rock we find. Let the sea be his judge." The mutiny was crushed. The secret was revealed. The old order, the Ironclad, was shattered forever. Draegan walked back to Elara and Kalen. He knelt before them, no longer a king addressing his subjects, but a father, a husband, addressing his family. He gently helped Elara to her feet, his hand surprisingly tender. He then pulled his son into a fierce, protective embrace, burying his face in the boy's hair, an act of open affection the crew had never thought possible. The king had revealed his weakness, and in doing so, had found a strength he never knew he possessed. The aftermath of the crushed mutiny was a strange, quiet dawn. The hierarchy of the Ironclad, once as rigid and unyielding as its name, had been shattered and was now reforming around a new, unshakable center, the captain's family. Kalen was no longer the invisible cabin boy. He was the acknowledged heir, the young prince of their floating kingdom. The crew, shamed by their past cruelty and awed by the captain's paternal fury, now treated the boy with a clumsy, reverent respect. And Elara, the cook who had become a quartermaster, was now something else entirely. She was the woman the king had listened to, the woman who had saved the heir. She was, in the eyes of the crew, the undisputed queen. In the quiet of the captain's cabin, the 3 of them began to navigate this new world together. The dynamic was no longer one of secrets and formal reports. It was a tentative, awkward, and beautiful process of becoming a family. Draegan, stripped of his cold, distant persona, was now simply a father, learning to connect with a son he had held at arm's length for too long. He taught Kaelin how to read the stars, how to navigate by the sun, his large, scarred hands gently guiding his son's small ones over the celestial charts. And Kaelin, feeling safe and seen for the first time, began to emerge from his silent shell. He still did not speak in full sentences, but the sounds returned. He would laugh, a real, clear sound, when Elara would tell him a funny story. He would hum a quiet, tuneless melody as he helped her in the galley. And one evening, as Draegan was telling him a story about his mother, a story Elara had encouraged him to share, Kaelin looked at his father and whispered a single, perfect word, Papa. It was a word that healed a wound a decade deep in Draegan's soul. Elara was the anchor for them both. She was Draegan's counsel, his confidant. In the wake of the mutiny, his first instinct had been to rule with an even tighter fist, to purge any hint of dissent. It was Elara who guided him toward a different path. You showed them your heart when you defended Kaelin, she argued. They did not follow you then out of fear, but out of respect for the father you are. Rule them as a father, not just a king. Loyalty, Draegan, is a stronger bond than fear. He listened. He began to learn the names of his men, to hear their grievances, to rule with a justice that was not just swift, but fair. The Ironclad transformed. It was still the most feared ship on the seas, but it was no longer a place of darkness. It was a true kingdom, loyal to its king, its prince, and its queen. As the days turned into weeks, Draegan and Elara found their own quiet rhythm. The unspoken love that had grown between them in the shadows was now a steady, warming fire. He would watch her, no longer as a guarded king studying a variable, but as a man watching the woman he loved. She, in turn, saw him not as the fearsome Iron Hand, but as a devoted father and the brilliant, lonely man she had come to admire and, she finally admitted to herself, to love. One evening, as they stood on the quarterdeck, watching the sunset, Kaelin was at the helm, his small hands confidently on the great wheel, Kian standing proudly beside him. The ship was at peace. Draegan turned to Elara. I brought you onto this ship as a tool, he began, his voice low and rough with emotion. Then you became a guardian for my son, then my advisor, my partner. He took her hands in his. But it is not enough. A king needs a queen, not just a title. Elara, a true partner, to stand with me, to guide me, to rule beside me. He looked at her, and the fierce pirate king was gone, replaced by a man vulnerable and full of hope. I did not know it then, but from the moment you stood against Silas, you were already the queen of this ship. I am just making it official. He did not have a crown of gold. Instead, he took the simple leather cord from his own neck, from which hung a small, intricately carved iron anchor, the symbol of his command. He placed it around her neck. Marry me, Elara, he said, not as a command, but as a plea. Be my wife. Be Kaelin's mother. Be my queen. Tears of joy streamed down Elara's face as she threw her arms around his neck. Yes, she whispered. Yes. The final scene is not a grand ceremony. It is a quiet moment, days later. Elara, Draegan, and Kaelin are standing together at the ship's rail, looking out at the endless horizon. Kaelin is no longer between them, but stands with one hand in his father's and the other in hers. He is talking, his voice still quiet, but clear, pointing out a pod of dolphins that swims alongside the ship. Draegan is not looking at the dolphins. He is looking at Elara, a look of such profound love and gratitude on his face that it is breathtaking. She leans her head on his shoulder, a queen at peace in her kingdom. The story of how a simple cook protected a lonely cabin boy had come to its conclusion. But the legend of the Iron King, his silent prince, and the wise, compassionate queen who had saved them both, was just beginning. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest acts of courage often come from the quietest corners, and that a family is not something you're born into, but something you build, sometimes in the most dangerous and unexpected of places. And if you believe that every great adventure deserves another chapter, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, so you'll be the first to know when we set sail on our next voyage.